Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Annette Johns, and I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Practice with the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers. I will be your moderator for today's education event, Workplace as Community, Moving Beyond Self-Care in the Prevention and Mitigation of Occupational Stress Injuries. Our webinar presentation will be approximately 60 minutes, followed by a 30-minute question and answer period that I'll moderate. But during the presentation, we encourage you to type in all your questions using the question mark widget to the left of your screen at any time throughout the presentation. And for your viewing experience, you can make the videos or the slides bigger and customize your platform to your own comfort level. The recording of this webinar will be available on demand and in coming days on the college's website under the Continuing Education tab. I now want to introduce our speakers for our webinar today, and their full bios are available on the webinar platform. So I know you want to hear from our presenters today and not from me. So I'm going to leave you to read the full bios, but I do want to say a few introductory words. So Melissa Bruce is one of our presenters and is a registered social worker with the Newfoundland Labrador College of Social Workers and currently works as a program supervisor with the Provincial Victim Services Program. Catherine DeBoer is also a registered social worker with the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers. Catherine is an associate professor at the School of Social Work at Memorial University and has a private practice in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Deanna Lankar is a registered social worker in Alberta and works as a trauma therapist specializing in occupational psychological injuries in helping professions. Melissa, Catherine, and Deanna, I'm really looking forward to your presentation, and I'm going to pass the virtual podium over to the three of you.
Thank you, Annette. So our topic today is occupational stress injuries, but in particular, what we can do at a community level, a workplace as community. And before I introduce us more fulsomely, I'd like to go to a polling question. And if you could all reply to this polling question while I do the introductions. So the question is, what has been your experience to date with occupational stress injuries? We're interested in whether you've been directly impacted, meaning that you've had an occupational stress injury yourself, indirectly impacted, so you've witnessed somebody having one, either a coworker or supervisor. You're aware of it, but you're not impacted yet, or you have no knowledge or experience of an OSI. So if you could sort of focus your attention on answering those questions while I introduce who we are. So yes, I am an associate professor at the School of Social Work here at Memorial University. And my interest in occupational stress injuries probably began when I was working as a social worker, and I believe I had vicarious trauma. So that became my interest. Interested in occupational stress injuries as an educator, particularly in how I can help to prepare professionals for the realities of social work practice. For 7 years, I belonged to the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, and I've published a few articles in the area of occupational stress injury. One of the dynamics or part of our MSW program at Memorial is to have a Pathways project, which is kind of like your graduate project. And in that capacity, I met Melissa, who was in our program, and then later Deanna, and both of them worked with me in the area of occupational stress injury. And I just thought, wouldn't it be nice if these two could meet together, because they both are working in the same areas and passionate about the same things. And so on a whim, I got the three of us together, and we've shared so much information over the years, and we decided to meet on a regular basis. We call ourselves the OSI Think Tank, and we meet and talk about what we're reading and what we're thinking. And it was through these conversations that we really started to develop this idea of a community of care. Both Melissa and Deanna come from a child welfare background, although neither are working in that area at the current time. So they have extensive experience as frontline child protection workers, and both of them have also been supervisors within child protection, I believe 4 years and 5 years, respectively. So they're coming at this from the perspective as a frontline worker and as a supervisor. Currently, Melissa works with, she's a program supervisor with the Provincial Victim Services Program, and Deanna has a private practice working in OSI treatment, particularly with first responders. One of the things that I do want to say before we get too much further is that we really do encourage questions. There's so much that we know, and I particularly say this about Melissa and Deanna, there's so much that they know, and it's, if you can ask the right question, there'll be a floodgate of really good information. So I do hope that you're paying attention to your questions, and we will try to have one half hour at the end for questions. Okay, so the response to the polling questions is that close to 50% of you have experienced an OSI, 39 indirectly impacted, 16% aware but not impacted yet, and 3 or 4% no knowledge or experience. So this is really helpful in terms of obviously a lot of you have some lived experience and are interested in knowing what you can do at a work level. All right.
So I'm just going to introduce what our plans are for today. This is kind of our agenda. We're going to quickly go through a very brief review of the types and causes of occupational stress injuries and some current best practices for treatment, mitigation, and prevention. So this is us just giving some foundational knowledge. We're hoping that most of you will be like, yes, I knew that, but also that we will have some moments that maybe expand your knowledge. And then the second half of our presentation is where we're really going to focus in on the idea of a community of care concept and some promising practice approaches. So we will stop halfway and try and answer any of those foundational questions. So feel free to send them in as they come up. And if we've already covered it or if we're covering it later, we'll skip it. But sometimes if we haven't explained things in the best level of detail, we don't want to miss those foundational pieces. So I will turn it over to Melissa.
Our discussions based on our inherited experiences. So I guess to begin with, speaking from experience, becoming a supervisor for the first time, especially so early on in your career like I did, can be really exciting, but also very anxiety provoking, very nerve wracking, as any change can be, especially with the adoption of new roles, new responsibilities. So I guess, based on our conversations, when you move up in different positions, you're given orientation regardless of how brief it might be, but you're always given orientations about what tasks you have to do now and what your priorities should be. And typically they, fall in line with administrative, financial, making sure clients get what they need, as well as things like human resources processes, how to manage performance and things like that. What are usually neglected, unfortunately, are the tools and guidance that you need to be able to be a supervisor and deal with your employees when they're going through difficult experiences, and also to deal with yourself when it comes to occupational stress injuries. So I was so happy to have been promoted. I found myself managing a team, but collectively, based on where we were working at the time, we were experiencing trauma exposures on basically a daily basis. And I guess throughout the course of these experiences, of course, they varied in level of severity and impact. However, it wasn't until something really big happened to us that I was sort of like, whoa, I don't really know what I'm doing here. I think I'm in over my head. So not going to share the nitty gritty details, but I guess, the basics are we had an incident at the office that I was working with. It involved a mass evacuation. It involved weapons. There was police involvement, all of those types of things. And I was totally ill-equipped to handle that. So I guess myself and my supervisor at the time sort of muddled our way through, doing everything we thought was right at the time. We, of course, had an employee assistance program, but it wasn't very well advertised. And unfortunately, none of us sort of knew what was available, or what we knew was available wasn't adequate to meet what we were needing at the time. So I guess then we were tasked with doing some research of our own, which of course took time. And meanwhile, I essentially witnessed my entire team fall apart because of everything that had gone on. So there's a proneness for supervisors and organizations to, of course, place blame on individual workers when they're struggling, whether that's intentional or not. I guess it depends on the situation that you're in, but I'm sure we've all heard of it. You're too soft, you're not hardened enough, the longer you're here, the less you'll care, those types of things. And I guess in addition to that, we also have discussions about a worker's fitness for the job at hand, and, sort of having those difficult conversations with people, telling them to look inside and evaluate whether or not this work is really for them. So in education and in the field, we talk about what we would do if we were harmed emotionally or psychologically while on the job. And we have these conversations as if there's a possibility that it's not going to happen, or that we're not going to be exposed to trauma, when really that's not the case. By nature, our profession puts us in the direct line of fire to be exposed to other people's suffering. And we experience trauma no matter what our role is. And it's really not a matter of if it will happen, it's when. So our approach and our assumptions, again, based off of, our experiences, we really have a habit, I think, in this profession, into falling into a fatalistic pattern of thinking when it comes to psychological wellness and OSIs. It's sort of, very defeatist. Whatever happens, we'll deal with it. There's nothing we can really do to change it or prevent it. But given what we know about trauma, how it impacts the brain, we should all really know better, and we should do better as an organization, as employers. While there's little within our jobs that we can often control, the workload, what our caseloads look like, who we serve, all those types of things, there are, things that we can do within our control and within our employer's control that can really influence how we experience our work and what we do when we're impacted. So although our focus within social work education and organizational culture tends to be more on self-care, in order to survive in this work and to be able to do it long term, which hopefully most of us, are, it's important to recognize that individual factors will never be enough to mitigate or treat OSIs effectively. We all know, we should eat healthy, we should get enough sleep, not consume a lot of alcohol, not smoke. We should do things we enjoy to sort of break up our day and really take care of ourselves. But really, the discussions we should be having are also should be focused on leadership and organizational policies and supports that can be put in place to contribute to a healthy work environment. And, we will do this today by, talking about our own knowledge about occupational risks, individual characteristics gained through working in the field. And I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Yes, just took me a minute to unmute myself. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we're all sort of starting on the same foundation here with respect to how we understand what an occupational stress injury is. And I think each word in this label is really important. An occupational stress injury is occupational. It's related to work. So the injury happens at work. It's exclusively from work. It could be due to the nature of work, to the duties that you have, etc. It's a stress. The harm is psychological in nature. It's caused by exposure to a traumatic event or a series of events, and or exposure to ongoing stresses, all of which occur at work. And so there may be physical manifestations. For example, you might have difficulty sleeping, you might have heart racing, you might have fatigue, but these are related. These are responses to the stress. And lastly, it's an injury. And this is a word that's becoming really important, that we understand an injury. An injury is something that's done to us. It's the result of actions of others or their failures to act. It's inflicted upon a person. So we don't say to someone, oh, there's something wrong with you, that's why your leg broke. We trace it back to what happened. And so it's really important that we don't see occupational stress injuries as inherent to the person. That person is weak, that person can't cut it, that person is just not meant to be a social worker. That's not what an injury is about. So each of those words is really important. Occupational stress injuries can be acute, meaning that they are linked to a specific event or series of events. So for example, if you witness somebody dying, you have threat of life to yourself, it's an event. But it also can be chronic, which means that it arises from accumulative, sort of non-acute exposure. And I think about this sort of like you have a 50-pound knapsack that you have to carry. Those who are experiencing an acute OSI have to immediately pick it up and run with it. And those who are experiencing chronic have this knapsack that they're carrying around, and maybe over years, maybe over months, things are slowly added to it. But in both scenarios, you're expected to carry the 50-pound knapsack. So that might be a metaphor that works. One thing that I think is really important that we understand, though, is that acute stress injuries tend to get all the publicity and the attention. And maybe it's because we understand them better, who knows. But if you were to get workers' compensation, for example, it's the acute stress injuries that are compensable, not the chronic ones. And I think that chronic ones can be harder to see as well because they can be slow acting. So I think it's really important that we understand that. Okay, in terms of the OSIs in social work, a person named Shackelford identified sort of 3 most common. Post-traumatic stress injury is sort of an acute reaction. Then we have secondary traumatic stress, and that comes with several. So acute, sorry, let me backtrack. Post-traumatic stress is when something has happened to you. So either your life is threatened or you see someone else's life threatened, but it's a direct exposure. Secondary traumatic stress is when you are witness to the suffering of others. So you may not experience it yourself, but you're witnessing it to it, and you're called to respond to it. There are 2 words that are also associated with this. Vicarious trauma might be something that you've heard, or compassion fatigue. Those are 2 examples of secondary traumatic stress. They're somewhat different, but they're kind of in the same wheelhouse. The third OSI that social workers commonly experience is something called burnout. And that is not in the DSM, but it's this chronic exhaustion that accompanies the work. You can be cynical, so on, but that's the third most common. And then most recently, we've been hearing a lot about something called moral injury, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And there's 2 other phrases that get tied up with that. Perpetration-based and betrayal-based. And we will, Deanna's going to be talking more about that next slide. Okay, so here's a quick and dirty summary of what we're talking about. Acute stress injuries, there's subtypes like PTSD, acute stress disorder, panic disorder, etc. Exposure involves exposure to a traumatic event. And the feeling that's often accompanies that is everything in the world is dangerous to me. The emotion is fear, hypervigilance, etc. Secondary traumatic stress, that's the stress from wanting to help or from helping traumatized individuals that are suffering. And the feeling that you get with that is, I've got nothing left to give. I'm all wrung out. And everything in the world is dangerous. Burnout is that physical, emotional, mental exhaustion It's prolonged and unmanageable work-related stress. And every day is a bad day is kind of the feeling that you get there. I'm going to turn it over to Deanna to talk about the other two. I just did want to say, though, the symptoms for occupational stress injuries are often very similar. So anyway, carry on, Deanna.
So moral injury is a concept that came out of the military, and we started hearing it with first responders a few years ago, and now people are really looking at it in the context of healthcare workers. And I think it applies to any helping professional. So there's two types of moral injury. One is around when you have done something that contradicts your morals or your ethics. It's usually because you felt you had no choice, either due to being ordered to do it or lack of resources, lack of control. The other one would be betrayal based, which is when someone can talk a great talk and tells you this is the ethics you're supposed to be abiding by, and then they're not able to walk the walk. And so you're witnessing things that really disrupt your worldview. So the feeling that comes with that is, I know it's wrong, but I can't change or control it. And I think this is one we're really seeing during COVID in the healthcare system, where lack of resources is leading to people making really difficult choices. The other one that we've heard about is sanctuary harm. It can be very similar to betrayal-based moral injury, but is a little bit different because it is someone who is coming and has had a trauma and reaches out for support and was told that support would be there for them. And instead, it's just more harm. And so the feeling is, I was promised that I would get help here, but instead I'm getting more hurt. And this is that place where we say that our workplaces are safe places. And no matter what happens with a client, you can bring that back here and there will be support. Sometimes that's in the form of EAPs, or your supervisor is supposed to offer support. And instead, either the support is not there or further trauma happens. So we're seeing these more and more commonly. As Catherine said, lots of overlap in symptoms, actually lots of overlap in treatment too. This is it's complicated, really.
We wanted to give you a sense of the prevalence of this. And just to start it off, it's really, really hard to get accurate and precise and Canadian statistics. And I've been looking and looking. So what I've done here is pieced together some numbers that we do know. 10% of the general population might experience a traumatic stress related disorder in their lifetime, but 45% of public safety personnel. So, and as the next stat suggests, in social work, it's twice that of the general population. So we're looking at 20% or more of social workers that would have a traumatic stress related disorder in their lifetime. 55% of social workers, so that was one study that I looked at. Another study, 55% of social workers meet the criteria of secondary traumatic stress, and 15.2 meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. This was in a British study of MSW level trained social workers. 46% of child welfare workers who leave their jobs do so because of work-related stress. And that was from a recent CASW study, 2018. 30 to 60% of child welfare workers have high to very high levels of burnout. 13 to 34% have PTSD, and 29 to 50% have secondary traumatic stress. And this was related to an article that I wrote where we did a lot of looking at prevalence, and that's kind of the summary of it. But yeah, so basically what I want you to see here from this slide is that this is occupational stress injuries is a risk factor for social work, and it's high. So we're looking at anywhere from 20% to 55% of social workers that might be experiencing this, 1 in 2 or 1 in 3. So gives you a sense of how serious it is.
Sorry, I see what you mean by the mute button now, Catherine. So I guess, why does this matter to us? So it matters because it can have impacts on individual levels, on your coworkers, on your families, and definitely on the organization from what we see. So the possible impacts, of OSIs can vary greatly with respect to the level of severity. Individuals can obviously, based on what Catherine just reviewed and Deanna, physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral effects as a result of traumatic experiences. This can definitely impact, our relationships with other people, with our family, how we respond to people, and, the changes in our behavior can impact others around us, regardless of whether, we're experiencing chronic or acute issues. I guess more so organizations in which workers are experiencing high levels of OSIs definitely need to be concerned about things like high absenteeism, turnover, poor timekeeping, poor performance, decreased productivity. Morale is definitely an issue, and motivation when it comes to work, as well as like employee satisfaction and complaints increase. And then that's sort of when you start to see people taking a lot of sick time. Like illnesses are more common, and things like accidents and incident reports start to go up. OSIs are really costly to organizations. It all comes down to the cost of recruiting, hiring, training, followed by a mass resignation, and then retraining or rehiring, retraining, all those things, doing it all over again. So, in order to keep things moving. Meanwhile, the people who are left behind, working against the vacancies, and I'm sure we can all speak from experience there, the increased pressure that this creates for the workers who are left behind, the increased stress levels, dissatisfaction, and decreased productivity that follows. So now we're going to look at some, there we go, causes. So I'll hand it back to Deanne.
Thanks, Melissa. So we're going to talk about some of the causes. And traditionally, there's a concept in the field of trauma exposures are what counts. So the way it's been measured recently is in what we call potentially psychologically traumatic exposures. So that's anything that could be classified as potentially traumatic. There's some well-accepted ones: exposure to an explosion, exposure to death. They're very common. We measure them regardless of your occupation. But this has been the whole story for a long time, right? More trauma means you're more likely to get hurt. And that's not what the research is showing. So one example out of the military is that medics were 17% less likely to have symptoms than soldiers in the same theater. So they're seeing the same thing. They have the same leadership structure. They have the same environment. They're in theater, so their family is at a distance. And yet that role was very different. So there's been some research looking at what else could it be. And one of the studies found that when we control for what the type of exposure was, it only accounts for about half of mental health diagnoses. So we want to start thinking about what else matters. So there's a couple things. One is your individual risk and protective factors. So we know that spousal support is the #1 protective factor. And I specifically said spousal. There's been lots of studies saying, well, what about friends? But somehow there's something about having a supportive spouse that is correlated in a different way. We also know that when you come into a situation with previous trauma exposures or a previous mental health diagnosis, whether occupational or not, that can be a risk factor. And this is a place where we stopped. We said there's causes, and maybe you've done something, you brought something to the table that made this harder for you. But the research shows that this still only gets us to about 60%. And we've got another 40% of causation outstanding. And the two things we talk about are looking at what the immediate context is. And I think we can all picture that we will have a very different response to something at 9:15 on a lazy Wednesday morning than at 4:15 after a frantic week on Friday. And that when there are other demands, so for example, workload demands, you are less able to deal with things. The other thing that we look at is the ongoing context. So maybe it's not just about today, it's about your overall support from your supervisor, your overall workload, how much you're working, all of those pieces. So we're going to go into a bit more detail about these down the road, but this is just kind of opening it up to say it's not just about what you see at work. It's about what you bring to the table and also what has wrapped around you. My specialty is treatment, so this is where I work now. And so there's a few things that I wanted to share with people. One is that when we go for a DSM diagnosis, we're very much about what is the impairment, what are your symptoms, which box do you check? But that's not how we treat people. We treat and help people get better, not based on what you have now, but kind of how you got there and figuring out some of those pieces. All of the OSIs we've brought up have very similar treatment. I would argue that some of that is because everyone loves to research CBT. And so CBT has great research for all of these things, but it's just because we like researching it. Other things with really strong evidence in the psychotherapy world are prolonged exposure, trauma-based CBT, and EMDR. There's lots of other things out there that have kind of promising evidence, but those are the ones that get the attention and have the highest level evidence according to kind of DSM criteria. All of the psychotherapies that are looked at for trauma treatment are showing significant immediate and sustained reduction and low attrition. And most importantly, there's no evidence of harm for any of these. They don't work for everyone, but we're not seeing that they're something that's harming anyone. Two other really popular responses to trauma exposures are peer support and crisis intervention, which is sometimes called CISD or CISM. There's not a lot of research on them, and two different reasons. So peer support, everyone thinks it's important and everyone is implementing it and everyone is doing it differently. And so there's really no research that can say what is working and not working because no two programs are the same. So if you're looking for a research topic, implementing a well-structured peer support program in multiple settings is a really promising research gap. And then when it comes to CISD, there was some early indications that it could be causing harm. So people have really backed away from it. And there's a lot of value to it. It's figuring out how to do it, when to do it, and how does it meet the needs of any specific group. So that's kind of the basics of treatment. And it turns out that we're actually getting really good at treating people after a trauma diagnosis. However, it's hard. By the time you get to the point where you are diagnosable, your symptoms have been in effect for a long time. There's probably been consequences in your family life. There's probably been consequences in your work life. And so we're trying to think about how do we do this differently? How do we start putting less people in danger? And instead of fixing them after, what can we do that's preventative? Before we get to prevention, I like to start with just saying we're talking about mitigation, which is immediately following a trauma exposure, there are some things that have been shown to help. One is that peer support. It has to be in a way that's supportive to the specific person. And so there are some really great programs out there that are working. Stigma and buy-in are going to be the main barriers to peer support. Second one is crisis intervention. And again, this is figuring out what's the right intervention at the right time and which people. The best research shows that crisis intervention should be voluntary. It should be encouraged, but forcing people into it sometimes can do more damage, especially when the group dynamic isn't already healthy. The most important thing for me that I have seen, and this is not from research, just from my experience, is that immediate psychoeducation. So once you've had a trauma exposure and you're starting to have responses that are not within your experience, having that awareness of what's likely to happen next, normalizing all kinds of reactions has been really important for the people I work with. And the interesting part there is that there is some research showing that people are more likely to be able to normalize things for their peers. And all of us work primarily in helping professions. And so when we are talking about looking at the person next to us and saying, how can I help them? That's a comfortable role. We're not always as good at looking at ourselves and figuring out how to help ourselves. And so sometimes it's just about buying into that and saying, look, this is how you can help your coworkers. The important thing about mitigation is that you should have a care plan before you're exposed. Because once you've been exposed to trauma and you're having a reaction, you don't have your full brain with you and you will not be developing any new plans. So any roles that have significant trauma exposures, and I mean either frequency or intensity, there should be a care plan. And this is where we start to talk about the balance between whose job is that? Is that the individual's job or is that the organization's job to make sure there's a care plan? Before we get into that, I do want to briefly talk about prevention. The thing about prevention is it's a little bit like cancer. There's no way to prevent any individual person from getting cancer. However, we have taken steps as a society to minimize the prevalence. And that's where we're at with OSIs. I can't turn to any person and be like, if you do X, Y, Z, you will not have this happen to you. I wish that was true. But we can say at a systemic level, what are the things we can put in place to make it less likely to happen and to make it less difficult when it does happen, that we get the right people, the right supports at the right time. So we are looking at moving on from this part of our presentation. So we're going to move into looking at what are the risk factors, how do we reduce them, what are the protective factors, how do we increase them, and what are the pieces around stigma and early intervention. So we're calling this kind of a pivot point. By now, you should have a basic understanding of the multiple types of OSIs, that there's similarities, and that we're looking at intersection of factors, and that there is treatment that can help. We need to start looking differently at prevention and mitigation. So if you have any questions about that part, now is the time to ask them. We will check the Q&A and see, and then after that, we're going to move on and look at what's the interplay with individual, organizational, and occupational risk factors.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. We did have a couple questions, so if we could look at some of those there now. But in the meantime, for everyone, if you do have any additional questions, keep putting them in the Q&A chat box, and we'll get to them, if not now, at the end of the presentation. So someone is asking if it matters what type of OSI they have with respect to treatment.
I will probably take that one. It doesn't matter because we look at symptoms. So where it came from is less important for treatment as figuring out where are you at today and how do we change what your future looks like. If you know what caused it, it does give us a bit of a head start on targeting things, but nope, it doesn't matter. The biggest part is acknowledging that you're not okay and that you might need some help.
Okay, great, thank you. Someone else is asking, around at what point do they go, should they start taking things seriously? So they feel maybe their concerns aren't bad enough yet. So how should they know, or what do they need to be looking for in terms of, is this something I need to take care of and take seriously?
Yes, that one's probably me as well. So I am really big on saying there's no trauma Olympics. It doesn't matter what hurt you. It doesn't matter how you got here. It doesn't matter if the person next to you has a bigger, worse problem. What matters is that as helping professionals, we're as healthy as we can be to do the work we need to do. So whatever it is that got you to this place, if you are feeling, I am not coming back to my baseline, I'm not where I used to be, that's the time to start reaching out and getting some support.
All right, thank you. I think that's it for the questions. We did have a comment around, in terms of the employer piece of it, and from their experience not having that employer support. So they raised that more of a comment than a question.
And that's exactly where we're going next. So thank you for that perfect segue.
Okay.
So I guess I'm just going to go through some risk factors here now. And I guess this is typically how it's looked at. So we first look at occupational factors, then we look at individual factors, then we look at organizational factors. So typically when we think of OSIs, we think of risk factors that come within your occupation first. So what is it about your job that or position that poses a risk? So, we know that first responders are going to be in situations that are going to be very traumatic. So what about that can we change? Probably nothing. The individual factors. So what is it about you that poses the risk? So like what Deanna was talking about earlier, do you have any prior diagnosis? Have you had any prior trauma experiences sort of that you bring through the table, that are going to impact you? And then finally, what is it about the organization that poses a risk? So are there any supports in place? What's the workload like? What type of work do you do? All those types of things are sort of what we look at. So this is where the thought process about individual self-care is sort of based. As a society, like we're very prone to, I guess, accepting the notion of self-help, and thus the focus of many organizations and employers, in probably the 90s, started working on developing workshops and putting them in place with respect to work-life balance, ensuring employees were eating healthy, they were having time to exercise, manage their stress levels, all those types of things. And while those types of trainings and programs are generally very well intentioned, and they're concrete and they're visible so that people know that, employers are taking things seriously, they typically don't help. They don't work with respect to decreasing the rates of burnouts or secondary traumatic stress. And actually, in the studies that I reviewed, staff morale actually continued to decrease as well. With the notion being that there's nothing else around it happening. So we're going to send you to this training or that training, and then you're going to come back and everything's going to be the same. Individuals in helping professions who reported greater social support actually suffered less psychological harm, had greater job satisfaction, had greater compassion satisfaction. The really ironic thing is that one of the first casualties when OSIs start to happen in the workplace is that we are very critical of each other. The first thing to sort of go is our connection and our relationships with other people around us. We start nitpicking at people. We start noticing that people are taking extra breaks or leaving early to go get their kids, or, and typically things just get really unhappy in the workplace. And that's where you start to see, things like gossip, bullying, involvement of respectful workplace and those types of things. So it's really important that we recognize that. And then also what we see is, staff sort of competing. So they might all go to lunch together, which is a super healthy thing to do. But the whole topic of conversation the entire time they're gone is all the nasty things that they've done that day or that week. And then, sort of upping the ante on each other, which is, not helpful, as well as you're exposing to people to your own trauma. You're putting that on top of theirs and vice versa. So I guess, in the essence, on the road to burnout and OSIs, we lose compassion for one another. And, research shows that we also lose compassion towards ourselves. So we become very hypercritical of our decisions, our actions, our behaviors. And, in general, we're not a profession that's known to be kind to ourselves. We're kind to everybody else. We take care of everybody else, but we're very hard on ourselves. So I guess to just set us up for the rest of this presentation is we're going to sort of turn that around. So we really want people to start thinking in the reverse order. So we'd like to think that organizational things come first, individual things come second, and then occupational things come afterwards. And mainly that's just because, the level of risks change and there are things that we can't really control. So occupational, we choose to be in this profession. We choose where we want to get a job and apply to, and, what kind of work we want to do, but we can't really control, how much of it we do, what we do once we get there, all those types of things. I mean, at the end of the day, everybody needs a paycheck and that's what we're here for. But also, there's very little about that we can change in terms of the work that we do. we also can't really control what we bring to the table. If you experience something really traumatic in your childhood, when you get to an adult, it doesn't mean that that's just erased, because now you're an adult and you've dealt with it and that's it. So there's not really much that we can do to change those things as well. So that's why we sort of want to focus on the organizational risk factors, because that's still within reach for us. That's still within reach for us as employees. It's also within reach for us as employers, because we want our staff to be healthy. So we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can, because we know that the jobs we're in are stressful. We know that there's different personality traits, there's different personal experiences, people have different things going on home. We know all that is happening. So given that knowledge, what are we going to do with it? So we're now aware that the most effective solutions that impact workplace trauma exposures are related to workload, reducing the trauma exposures, talking about workers' feelings of effectiveness, having positive social supports. We really want to recognize the prevention and mitigation of OSIs, and that requires us to take a look at the larger systematic issues. We need to stop focusing so much on self-care. Self-care is certainly a good thing to do, and it's great, that people do it. I'm not by any means discounting, saying don't take care of yourselves. It's just like that alone cannot prevent an OSI, and it can't treat it, it can't mitigate it on its own. Sometimes we do contribute to the environment around us individually, and I think we need to own that in terms of, creating negative or toxic workplaces, and we need to own our role in that. But at the same time, that does combine with organizational factors that don't sort of step in and nip that in the bud. And then as a result, those things combine and sort of create the perfect storm. And then self-care is not enough to fix it. So the question we are striving to answer is, how do we wrap around the individual and the occupation in hopes of preventing and mitigating psychological harm to our workers?
So when we talked about doing this presentation, we wanted to just kind of think of what do we want people to take away. So as we go through these next slides, one of the things is we want to start thinking about, what does a community of care look like? Instead of us being out there trying to self-care ourselves out of a problem, we need to have that connection and network of people who can care for each other. It's kind of like when you have a broken leg, no one will say to you, walk it off. There are points where once you have become injured, it is too late for you to help yourself. You can't see it. You wouldn't know what to do even if you could. If you take nothing else out of this today, the second bullet here is the number one point for me, which is, in helping professionals, we need to acknowledge that traumatic injury is a matter of when, not if. And I say this because if every single one of you has a plan for what you're going to do when things go wrong, and a few of you get to retirement and you never use it and you get to shred it and be like, Deanna wasted my time making this, I will celebrate that for you. What is so much worse for me is the number of people who are like, I never thought it would happen to me, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know what works for me. I hadn't thought about it. It just was never supposed to happen to me. So if we all go into this and plan, I might be the one that gets hurt one day. The person next to me might be the one that gets hurt one day, but someone here will, because that's the kind of job we're in. And it's figuring out, what will your plan be? What are you, who are the people around you that are helpful? What does that look like? Now, we also take that to an organizational level, because a lot of organizations have also treated the idea of traumatic injury as an exception and an abnormality and something that is way off in the corner. And if we have to deal with it, we will. And organizations need to start changing too. And any organization's primary responsibility is to their staff. We all know that phrase of putting your own oxygen mask on before you help someone else. And that is what preparation for traumatic injury is at the organizational level. You need your workers to be as healthy as possible so that they can help your clients. And that also links back nicely into social work education. Social work as a profession has an obligation to ensure that social workers are as healthy as they can be, because we know that healthy social workers can change the world, but unhealthy social workers can also change the world, and not always in a positive way.
This concept of community of care is not something that you can, Google and find. This is a phrase that we've perhaps seen now and again in the literature, but it's also sort of a phrase that the three of us have been using in our conversations together. And I want to take a little moment to talk about what we mean by this. When we talk about community of care, we're looking at a work environment that shares a culture, mentality, milieu, with respect to how you understand occupational stress injuries, the prevention and mitigation. So there are certain things that needs to happen for you to have this common culture. Education and training at all levels is really important. It's important that your frontline workers speak the same language as your supervisors, as your managers, as the top folks. That you're sharing a common understanding, that you're educated around what the warning signs are, to the point that you can do some self-assessments and say, "Ooh, I might be in trouble here," and that you can look out for your coworkers. This is where we have this compassion for each other, and not in a gossipy way, but just to actually talk to your social workers and say, how are you doing after X or Y? That was a really difficult case that you had. How are you doing? Are you sleeping? Are you, taking that day off that you're entitled to? This kind of vigilance in terms of looking after each other is really important. And in order to do that, you need to have this common language and a common understanding, and a sense of responsibility for each other. Supervisors play a key role in this, and also peer support. So we'll be talking a bit more about this, but it's very important that you feel that support, that from your supervisor, you understand that you are a valuable part of the organization, that the work that you're doing is valuable, and that they care about you and your mental health. And that goes for your coworkers too. Part of the community of care is knowing what resources to access, knowing how to access them, and as supervisors, knowing what to offer your team. And Melissa has some great stories about when she became a supervisor and just feeling like, oh my goodness, like I don't know what to, where to send my people. And I think that as a supervisor, you need to know where to send your people. Open dialogue and conversation. This is the antithesis of shame, dark humor, and fatalism. And these are some things that I see in social work. I particularly see it in our master's level students who have practiced in social work, and sometimes they come and get their master's because they're burnt out. It's like, I need a break, and I'm going to get my master's as a way of getting that break. Not all master's students are in there, but that certainly was an element for me when I got my master's as well. But to be able to talk about, there's a sense, I think, within social work that, once you get that incident that you have, or once you start to get jaded, you've got your coworkers saying, okay, well, now you've made it. Now you're a social worker. That's not the message we want to give. We want to give this message of, yes, this is a matter of when and not if, but this is not something that we wish for. It doesn't make us a great social worker. We should be exercising good care at this point, and compassion for each other. And again, asking these questions, are you okay? So this is not something that, we see this reflected in our language a lot. In the police, there's a phrase called eating the gun, which I think refers to suicide ideation. When we hear these kinds of phrases, we need to be aware of them and to say, no, that's not what we're going here as an organization. Okay, I'll pass it over to you, Melissa.
Okay, so workplace culture. many, if not all of us, work in places in which we're faced with, really high demands, but we have very little control over anything else. In addition to that, similar to first responders, we often have to suppress our own emotions and feelings in order to perform our jobs and to be there for our clients. We have high caseload numbers. We have no control over the amount of work we have that we're assigned, or ultimately who we're going to serve. These risk factors for OSI, can't be eliminated. The risk will never be zero, and it would be unrealistic to sort of think that we can do that and make it zero. However, there are organizational factors that can effectively contribute to the prevention and mitigation of OSIs. So stigma reduction, programming, mental health education, and additional training are some ways that organizations can step in. In order for this to happen, leadership needs to be on board. In addition, trauma exposures can't be eliminated in many of our workplaces. However, the impact of such exposures can be, relatively short-lived or reversible if it's detected early enough and if workers receive the proper intervention. So as leaders, as supervisors, as employers, first of all, if we are really serious about addressing the problem of OSIs, we need to get on board and we need to, combat our staff's, what might be a bit of resistance, might be a bit of skepticism. Client-focused service has become, the buzzword in a lot of our workplaces in recent years. And we really need to ask ourselves whether or not this is something that can truly be offered if we're not willing to ensure that, our staff have all the tools that they need available to work in a way that's sustainable for them, for their clients, and ultimately for the organization. We need to create check-in plans and give people the opportunity for peer support. It's good if you can create a check-in plan in advance, and that would be the best way, so that we're not trying to plan, like Deanna talked about, after something happens. A critical incident, of course, will look differently to you depending on where you work and what sort of, you're facing on the day in, day out, but we need to plan in advance. We need to support, stress leave, or, when an employee needs to take a mental health day, we need to be open to that and not, be critical of that. And I think that we're probably all guilty of sort of, having an attitude where somebody calls in sick or whatever, and then you're sort of questioning whether or not they're actually sick, but we need to support that. We need to be open to it. We need to ensure that employees have access to EAPs and they're knowledgeable about everything that's offered. So in my example earlier, I had no idea what EAP did. I knew that they offered counseling, that's it. I didn't know what they had in terms of crisis response, what extra supports, that could be offered universally to all my staff in this situation. Like, I had no idea, and that really took some time to dig through. So if we can do that in advance, again, that's best, because then it's sort of at the ready. We've got it so that when something bad happens, we can pull it out and just have it to refer to. So the availability of qualified mental health practitioners, who specialize in trauma-focused work are definitely helpful. We need to engage in stigma reduction strategies and education for our workers. Stigma is a huge part, and I really feel like that's a massive reason why workers don't come forward, aren't open to discussing it, and sort of, I'm sure we've all had employees, we mention EAP and they sort of like roll their eyes a little bit and, not really confident in what happens. But I think if we can reduce the stigma around that, that's a piece of the battle. Disability management systems, and we need to get, our disability management programs, if you have one. If you don't have one, I think we need to create one. If we do have one, we need to get them engaged early on. There's nothing wrong with consulting with a disability management person in advance. I'd rather go to them and ask the questions in it and not have needed to consult with them than sort of be left going down a disciplinary route with employees that could have been solved perhaps if we had to consult disability management first. We need in-house mental health professionals if that's available. I know that that's, sort of pie in the sky for a lot of us, but if that's a possibility, then that would certainly be ideal. And if not, we need an established referral process. So even, as part of your check-in plan, coming up with that and saying, so if this happens, we're going to make a referral to EAP, and you can debrief about it and then sort of go from there. I think that that's important. Return to work and stay at work programs and planning, and also workplace accommodation. So if people are struggling on a regular basis because of something that's happened to them, it's important that we nurture them and we take care of them, and give them time to sort of process, work through what's happened. While all the processes need to be the same for everybody, it's essential that the management of OSIs vary on an individual basis. Not everyone is going to have the same reaction to the same thing, and not everybody needs the same sort of treatment or response. It's important to note that while the responsibility to self-identify and acknowledge, the signs and symptoms of OSI, as well as seeking out the support sometimes, really rests with the individual. It's on us as employers, as supervisors, to create an environment in which people are not stigmatized for doing that, and so that education and understanding of OSIs is really high. Education and training for employers. We're not directly exposed to trauma because we're not on the front line. I'm sure people have had supervisors in the past that, may have not ever worked on the front line. They've come into an organization and started immediately at management. So we don't know what our workers face on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that, and we, face that, and are willing to learn and willing to hear people out. We need to do that in order to really understand what they're going through, and then understand the reactions that people have to that. So, ultimately, we really need to recognize that without us buying in and ensuring that we're healthy as well, because, supervisors can be impacted by workplace stress. And, I'm sure we all hear gory details of things, on case consultations and things like that. We need to be healthy ourselves, and we need to be able to buy in order to make our teams healthy. It's important that we're all people, we're all struggling with the effects of stress, require extra listening. And, we really need to make sure that our staff are fully engaged. So recruitment, OSIs are a growing concern for employers, really regardless of what sector you fall in. So public, private, community, it really doesn't matter. OSIs are, sort of with us all. In recent years, there's really started to be a shift in thinking, and somewhat a recognition of the fact that our work can really impact us. But really where we fall down is okay, we know that it's happening. What are we going to do about it? Attracting good talent and retaining workers is a cause for concern, especially in job markets like what we have right now. We have trouble where vacancy rates are very high, and getting skilled workers to fill positions long term, is a real problem. And I guess that comes from, our new employees are typically, millennials born in the 80s, 90s, when during a time when conversations about work-life balance, about workplace stress were happening, and things, were sort of moving along, very different from what our parents might have experienced in the 50s, 60s, as a generation that weren't very tolerant of mental health, and didn't really talk about it. So as a generation, 80s and 90s people grew up in a time where mental health was actually discussed. Many of us are not open to sacrificing our health and our personal lives for the sake of a job. So really, typically, turnover is high with those workers, because the first sign that something is going wrong, the first time they feel that they're not being taken care of, they're out, and the vacancy rates everywhere else are impacted by that, because then they can easily move somewhere else, whereas before, people sort of stayed in jobs for their full career. So throughout our discussions in preparation for today, we really reflected on different organizations that we worked with, different recruitment processes we've been involved in, students that we've encountered over the years, and it really became clear to us, and again, this is not research-based, this is observation-based on our own experiences, but really the types of people and the personalities that are attracted to helping professions like social work, there's sort of a type. As organizations, we often recruit people who are high achievers. They're very calm and empathetic and compassionate towards other people. They're highly critical of themselves. So in addition to that, they also tend to have a knowledge and understanding of, social injustices that our clients are experiencing on a daily basis, but that also often comes from having lived experiences and personal experience with some of those same issues. So it's important to note that, these factors make us more susceptible to being impacted negatively by our work, which places us at a higher risk for OSI. So high performance, for example, is commonly linked to, an overall sort of anxious disposition. Not that people have anxiety diagnoses, but, they're more prone to feeling anxiety or anxiousness over a specific thing. Empathy is strongly linked to the development of OSIs and prior trauma exposures, in spite of, the fact that as a supervisor, I would hope that anyone in my workplace who might come with lived experience has had the opportunity to sort of unpack that and recover from the effects of it. Regardless, having a prior trauma experience can compound with future trauma experiences. So just because you've, lived through it and dealt with it doesn't necessarily mean that it's gone. Being self-critical can lead to, workers' feelings of failure or guilt or unworthiness or, shame and those types of things. And that's not to mention the fact that all of these things cause us to be more distressed when we're hearing people's distressing stories. So we're working with people who are suffering. We've also got all these other things that say that we're going to suffer more by hearing other people's stories. So since organizations are really the ones to seek out these traits in potential workers, we feel really strongly that, we should really recognize what this means as employers in order to combat the downfalls of, what we look for in a perfect social worker. We also need to understand that self-compassion can help decrease the risk of OSIs, and employers should really be the ones to provide the adequate training and support to staff regarding OSI prevention, recognition, mitigation, treatment, all of those things in order to create and maintain a psychologically safe and healthy workplace. It's crucial that that we foster an environment in which self-compassion is high and that it can be, it can thrive, and that, the risk that our workers are going to be psychologically harmed through the process of their work is decreased. So it's for this reason that, we need to focus on it as an organization. Even like before workers come in the door, we need to look at our recruitment strategies and sort of what we're looking for and figure out if we have processes in place that are going to take care of our workers once they get in.
In terms of what supervisors can do, and perhaps what the structure of an organization, how structure of an organization can change to be helpful, one of the things that we read a lot about in the literature is that it's the amount of time that you're exposed that can put you at greater risk. And the exposure is to traumatic events, but also exposure to people suffering. And there's actually been research on the number of hours per week that put you at, and how much more hours put you at greater risk, and so on. So one of the recommendations would be to reduce trauma exposures on an ongoing basis by decreasing the number of hours of direct client contact per week. And you can say, well, they have so many clients and they need to do this. But can we balance this somehow? How can we decrease these numbers? And here's one example. And I don't know a lot about child protection. I haven't worked in it. But I do know from listening to stories of my MSW students that there are workers that do frontline. There are workers that are intake, and there are workers that do policy. What if we were to mix that up a little bit so that you are doing policy and frontline work, so that you can have a decrease the number of direct client hours that week, and do other work. So you're also working different parts of the brain, doing different things. That's a great mitigation factor. Also, having mixed caseloads, so you don't have somebody that does all the family violence, someone that does all the child sexual abuse, someone that does all the, that can be a problem too. So balancing direct contact with non-contact and having a caseload of clients with a range of issues and severity, both of these have been known to decrease the incidences of OSIs. I want to move now to what supervisors can do. There's lots that supervisors can do. I think the first thing I want to say is that supervision can in itself be stress-inducing. And as a supervisor, be aware of what climate you're creating with your people that you're supervising. And is it a climate of calmness, or is it a climate of accountability? Can we balance those two? Can we have supervision as something that your staff look forward to? That would be important. We want supervisors to be aware of OSIs, to be aware of trauma exposures and what their team is experiencing, be aware of the trauma cycle and how to complete the trauma cycle, and be aware of trauma injuries for both you and your people. We want to be able to have you speak the same language as the people that you supervise, so that they can come to you and say something and you would know what they mean. There's a really strong need for self-compassion. What we know from the research is that when workers are self-critical, they are less able to help and they're at higher risk of OSIs. So if you go through something that's very traumatic and you say, you know what, I went through something that was very traumatic and I'm okay. Or that was difficult. It's okay that I recognize that that's difficult. It's okay that I respond to that in a way with sadness or fear or whatever is socially appropriate. That's okay. That doesn't make me a bad social worker. In fact, that might make me a good social worker. So have that self-compassion. We know that self-compassion is helpful, that it reduces the incidences of OSIs. As supervisors, you can help to create a community of care. Help people know where to look for help. Help people, help build a team where you have compassion for each other, and where when someone says, "I need a mental health break," or a mental health day, the rest of the team isn't rolling their eyes, but saying, "Go for it. You need it. We support you." So having that kind of mentality. Lots of stuff on person-focused supervision. Supervision that's agency-focused is not as helpful as, in fact, not very helpful at all, but to have supervision that focuses on the person. So rather than looking at, well, what do the agency needs? What does the agency want you to do to perform, blah, blah, blah. We're looking at, what do you need as a person? How can we help you do your job? Encourage a pro-social versus a personal distress response to trauma. Lots of stuff on this. A pro-social response is when you are faced with the suffering of others, do you then say, what can I do to help? How can I help? What is my role? What can I do? That's a pro-social response. Versus a personal distress response, which is, oh my God, am I going to be able to cope with this? And speaking as an educator, I see students who take a personal distress model response. Oh my God, there's an assignment. Oh my God, how am I going to cope? How am I going to cope? Rather than looking at, how can I do this? What can I do? So we want to encourage that pro-social, that active response. And the last point I want to make is, as a supervisor, you need to know your people. You need to know what is going on in their personal lives. This is so important. Do they have a supportive spouse? Do they have supportive family? What can you as a supervisor do to encourage that part of their life so that that can be nurturing and helpful for them? So when we say things like, yes, you got to work the weekend, or sorry, you got to work late, even though we know as a supervisor, no, that might mean that they're not going to have dinner with their kids. That's not helpful. So work and life is a two-way street. And we often think about this work-life balance as making sure that work doesn't get into our personal life. But it goes the other way. Our personal lives get into our work. And as supervisors, you need to know. And I don't mean you need to know chapter and verse and know all the details of your private life of the people on your team, but you need to know what is healthy in their private life that can help with work, and how can a healthy workplace help their private life. It's a two-way street. Lastly, when we talk about self-care, we often think about self-care as bubble baths and so on. That's not what we're talking about here. We need to have broad views of self-care. Self-care includes boundary making. Self-care includes this looking at life and work in this two-way street. I'm going to leave it at that because we've got so much more to cover. Go to you, Deanna.
I am just going to quickly say, ooh, hold on. What about self-care? So we are not saying that self-care is a bad thing. What we are saying is that self-care is an individual solution to a systemic problem. And so self-care can help you be ready. Self-care can have a protective factor, but it is not going to treat an existing injury. Catherine said some of the things we need to look at self-care more, but this is not where we're at with self-care. We're saying it's good. It will help more people be more ready, but when someone does get injured, it's not a failure of self-care. It's a bigger systems issue. Please bear with us. We switched a 3-hour presentation into a 60-minute presentation. I just have one more slide, but I think it's an important one. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the innovative practice approaches that we're seeing that are cultivating this community of care. So I worked with a team in this is a hospital-based team, and one of the things that they implemented is called care pairs. And so the idea was that if you are open to the idea of providing or receiving support in any moment, that you would just signal that with, for them, it was a little badge that they wore, and it was actually a cute little pair. And the idea was, if you need a moment, if you need 30 seconds to 3 minutes for someone just to be like, this just happened to me and it hurt, or it was great, or whatever, and I just need to have a moment of human connection, you would seek out someone who has the pair on, because they were saying, when I got to work today, I felt able to be that person for someone else. I'm open to the concept. I have the capacity, and I'm good to do that. And so it was not mandatory. It was something that people were able to opt in and opt out as their lives went up and down, but it opened that workplace up to the idea of sometimes we need to ask for help, and asking for help can be a 30-second ask. And that also contributes to some of the lack of stigma, right? We want to look at reducing that. I saw there's some questions in the chat about stigma. Absolutely, it's one of the biggest things. As social workers, we're really good at saying those people, the ones over there on the other side of my fence, they need help. But actually, it's us on this side of the fence that sometimes need help. And that's a really hard position to be in when you're used to being the helper. Another thing that we saw is something called the pairing of the gratitude jar and the chuck it bucket. And so this is a team meeting strategy where you have two pieces. The gratitude jar is where you put things that you want to keep, that you want to be thankful for. You can build them up over a week, over a month, over a year. They can become this ongoing kind of team building thing. But paired with the gratitude jar is the chuck it bucket, which is the things that happened this week that I need to just tell someone about, and then we can be done with it. It needs to go away. And the pieces, things that this organization were doing, they would write it out, and anything in the chuck it bucket went in the shredder at the end of the meeting. I have said this, it is now off of my chest. It is gone, it can go. Another intervention, which I won't talk about at great depth, but we did want to highlight, is called Together for Life. It was out of the SBPM in Montreal. And what's interesting about this to me is it was a very targeted program. As Catherine alluded to earlier, there is a problem with suicide in policing. It's an occupational factor. It's occupation-wide that we know about this. The Montreal Police Department went out into this program, and what was key for them is every person in the organization attended the training. It was 4 hours for frontline staff and 4+4 for anyone with any kind of supervisory responsibilities. So we're not talking about weeks and weeks. We're talking about a half day or a full day, depending on your role. But everyone went. from the janitor to administrative staff, officers, civilians, management. Everyone went. They had a shared language, and a big focus of it was, how do you look out for the person next to you? And what they found was a significant immediate reduction in suicide rates, and it was sustained for 15 years, which is actually unbelievable when you think about how many resources have been thrown at this. So short interventions can work. What happened in this case is it normalized it, it was stigma reducing, and everyone had shared language to talk about it. The other one that we wanted to draw your attention to, if you are interested in this, is called the STEADY program. It was done with nurses. I want to say in the UK, but it could have been the US because I don't always pay attention. It actually could have been Ontario. Either way, the idea was they did this implementation where they looked at creating specific peer groups and giving people the information about how to check in on themselves. And so social support was the big piece. Tracking distress was the second one. How do you know if you're okay? Because what we know, especially with compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout, is they sneak up on you. And usually you don't know that you're not okay anymore because it has been gradual. You have been just a little bit off of your baseline for a long time. And it's often someone else having to say to you, do you know that you've changed? But if the whole organization is in that, it's really hard to be able to measure ourselves. And so what they did was implement either monthly or quarterly self-assessments, just so that people could see for themselves, hey, 6 months ago, I was sleeping more than I am now. I was eating better. I was feeling better. I was less angry. And when you see it for yourself, that can sometimes be an impetus for change. So we have jammed a lot of information into a very short amount of time. We know that. We're very sorry, but we are open to putting together something else. So 2 pieces. We do have a poll, which should be active now that I clicked it, about what would be helpful going forward. And then we will take questions.
Does anyone have a question? Annette, do you have any questions? There she is.
Yes. So while you're waiting for people to answer the poll, I can just go through some of the questions that we've had. And I guess the first one is someone is saying there is a significant need for organizations to be trauma informed and how this trauma presents emotionally, physically, etc. At all levels of service delivery as a starting point, to seeing a shift to community of care versus individualized self-care. So how do we as frontline workers create conversation to action these changes towards communities of care or a community of care?
I'll answer a little bit first, and then hopefully Deanna and Melissa can kick in. I guess the first thing that I would say is if I was a frontline worker and wanting to look at this, I think the first person I would talk to is my supervisor, and work with them in terms of, are we speaking the same language? How can I work with you and be able to talk to you about this openly? So that would be my first step.
I think too, it's important to, yes, talk to your supervisor. And I think as supervisors, we need to be open to having those conversations and not take it necessarily as a criticism of what we're not doing. And I think that that's really sort of easy to fall into. But I think frontline workers have ears and eyes where supervisors don't have them. So they do have a level of knowledge that we don't necessarily have. So it's important that if you're seeing something or seeing a need for something, that you somehow bring it forward, whether, I've said anonymously, write me a note, tell me something that you need, or, find some way to have that conversation, because we might not know you need it. It's not that we don't want to give it to you. It's that we don't know there's a need there. That would be my advice.
I also think social workers specialize in grassroots, bottom up. And so some of it, and we're really good at creating community. And so some of it is about just having that purposeful piece as far as what do my interactions look like in the workplace? How am I creating a community in my workplace? Because it's really, this is a balancing act. It's really easy for organizations to say it's completely on the worker. They need to self-care themselves. And it's really easy for workers to say it's all on the organization. They need to take care of me. And we are not advocating for either of those. This is a two-way street, and it's finding that balance, and it is tricky. But I think starting the conversations starts at the front line and just saying, being open about what's going on with you. And I think every single one of us has a role to play in the reduction of stigma. And so I know for a lot of the workers, so I work with people who are off work and are going back. And that's one of the things that they say is I tell everyone why I was off, and I tell them how I got better, and I tell them that they can come to me if they need help. Those are frontline workers, and they are changing their culture. I can tell you this because now I show up places and people are like, oh, we know who you are. We know why you're here. And I'm going to need to talk to you later. And I'm like, perfect. The culture is shifting, and it is not because management has shifted, unfortunately, or fortunately. So I think that's part of it is don't give up hope. Social workers absolutely change things from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And your comments do reflect on some of the other questions that have been asked. And I'll just kind of summarize some of those questions. And if you have any, I know we're getting short on time, any concluding thoughts around those questions. One being, if, Melissa, you talked about the role of supervisor and, people bringing those concerns because the supervisor may not know all the time. One of the questions came in around, how do you address or suggestions for addressing when the trauma that you're experiencing may be intensified or caused by, actions of a supervisor or non-action of a supervisor. So that being one. And another one around how do we reduce stigma so that we can have those conversations. And I guess thirdly, looking at some of the questions, and Deanna, you kind of just spoke to that one, thoughts on disclosing gaps, in work history because of an OSI. So I'll leave you with those three percolating thoughts that you've already kind of addressed throughout the presentation in the first question there, but is there anything you want to highlight in particular with regards to those three aspects?
So I guess in terms of, I see the question there about trauma being caused by a supervisor or lack of support. I think that goes back to, the description of like moral injury and sanctuary harm that Catherine was talking about earlier. You expecting there to be help when there is none. And that in itself can be an injury. So I think it's important, whether it's your direct supervisor or maybe a supervisor above, I think somebody within that organization, I would certainly hope, is open to having that conversation and bringing those concerns forward. And I know that can be really uncomfortable, but this whole topic is uncomfortable to a lot of different people. And I guess one of the things that we have to do, whether it's, as employees or employers, is make people more comfortable talking about it. And then that goes to stigma reduction. And I think that can be done at either level. And like Deanna was saying, it's not really one or the other. As a manager, I'm talking about mental health more. I'm, promoting that discussion with my employees because I want them to know that I know something about it and I want to hear about it. But likewise, if somebody brings something forward to me, then I want to make sure that we have that discussion. And if they're okay with it, I want to have that discussion in front of everybody. So everybody hears what they need, not necessarily singling out the person, but like, I want to bring those issues forward. Hey, somebody told me that this is a problem. Is it a problem for anybody else? Do we need to do something as a group about it? So I think, sort of being okay with being uncomfortable is one part, but also the other part is educating supervisors about having those conversations. And I'd want somebody to go to my supervisor. If they weren't comfortable having a conversation with me, I'd want them to go above me.
It's also reducing the internalized stigmatization. Like I think that we think, I shouldn't feel this way. Your supervisor is not your gatekeeper to mental health. And I would recommend that students and new professionals or even seasoned professionals get a therapist. Get a therapist before this happens, Make sure that you've got supports in place so that when it does happen, you suddenly aren't grabbing for a therapist who doesn't know you. You know, get therapy once a month just as a way of keeping healthy, like you go to the gym. That is so important. And you don't need a supervisor to tell you that. You can do a lot of this work on your own without the permission or endorsement of a supervisor. So mindful of the time.
Yep.
Did you want to share the results? Did you get the results coming from your last polling question? Did you want to end with some commentary around that?
Oops.
Oh, there we go.
That's why you should not let me run these things. There we go. I
There we
think
go.
that it's up there. So I don't think we're very surprised by this, that there's lots of interest, but a lot of it is in the implementation. And I think that is the tricky part. Did see in the comments, someone said this would be great as a workshop. Absolutely. We know that there are more good ideas out there, and we've just picked out a few, and that this is very much a conversation. And there's so many more options out there. I also wanted to say, I saw somebody in the questions point out the before operational stress program. So that is a great program. It is an example of when academics work well with those with lived experience. So that program had a lot of research base, and it was pulled together with the help of the people in it. And I know quite a few people that have gone through it. They found it helpful. I've seen the material. Actually, some of the stuff that we talk about today is right in there. So that links back to what Catherine said. The idea is knowing that you are likely to have some level of traumatic injury if you work in a profession with traumatic exposure, and knowing what the signs are specific to you, but also generally. And so that when it happens, you're like, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how it's going to look. Yeah, so it's big on the psychoeducation and practicing skills, which is another thing that we can all be part of, is just being able to say, that one, this is the phrase that I often teach people is, ooh, that thing, that stuck to me. I thought I was good with it, but it's not. That stuck to me, and I'm going to do something about it. And that's probably the biggest thing that we can do in those little snapshots, because we're really great at the tough it out. I took the worst files. I took all the worst files on the worst days, and I work with the hardest clients. And we're not as good at saying that was harder than I thought it was going to be. And I have a coping strategy, and I'm going to do it. We do them. Social workers are actually really good at self-care. We do lots of things. The only one that we normalize talking about is alcohol. And also we need to stop that. So that's my other thing, is that's not the only way of coping. Lots of us have great proactive strategies, and it's not just saying, you know, you're going to need a bottle of wine after that one. No, there's lots of other things we can do, and we all do them. We just don't talk about them. So there is that piece of we reduce stigma when we talk about the good things we're doing too.
Well, that's great. Great message to end off on. So we are unfortunately out of time. I'm sure this could have been a full day session, as you said, or many different workshops might come out of this particular webinar today. But I do want to take the time to thank Melissa, Catherine, and Deanna for facilitating this excellent webinar for us today, and for sharing their experience, expertise, and knowledge on this topic. And, you know, a lot of important information was shared, and we really just hope you take away information and strategies that you can use, you know, in your own workplaces in the prevention and mitigation of occupational stress injuries. So thank you, Melissa, Catherine, and Deanna, for taking the time from your busy schedules from all over, you know, nationally and internationally, from where you're located, and just really taking the time to facilitate this discussion today. It is truly appreciated. Just wanted to let participants know that the PDF of the presentation is available in the resource section on the webinar platform, as is the contact information for Catherine, Deanna, and Melissa, if you do want to follow up. Also, RSWs may claim 1.5 required CPE credits for attending this webinar as per the NLCSW CPE policy. And as you begin to sign off, we do ask that you complete the evaluation that'll appear on your screen, as your feedback is always greatly appreciated, and as we plan, you know, additional CE webinars. And on that note, just to say thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.